Let's move on to topic number 2. Again, we have like Elon Watch on this show. It seems like we're stalking him at this point. The news just came out that a judge has banned X in Brazil, and it's now, I think, going to the Supreme Court to see if that ban holds. And of course, the Brazilian government, as part of this ban, is saying, well, Starlink, another Elon company, or rather another Elon business within SpaceX, is still providing access to X within Brazil. And so Brazil is like, hey, you better enforce this ban with your internet service provider. And Elon's saying some version of fuck you unless and until you unfreeze X's assets in Brazil. So Brazil's using the courts and regulation and laws to, I guess not blackmail, but control Elon's businesses there. And Elon is using his multiple strategic companies and assets and power, which we've talked about many times on this show, to say a version of fuck you back, unless you moderate what you're asking me to do in this way or that way. I'd love for us to continue to have this debate, because at the end of the last episode, Amir and I talked about Elon's increasing strategic hard power. So not kind of soft power with like Mark Zuckerberg's algorithms, but hard power, rockets and satellites and controlling the conversation. This is an example of this, of saying to the government, hey, screw you, I can deliver my version of the internet into your population unless and until you change your policies or unfreeze my assets. What do we think about this? Emil, you're, I think, the contrarian here about you've got much more sympathy for his positions typically. What's your thoughts on this?
I'm totally aghast that Brazil, which is one of the world's biggest democracies, would be organized. I don't know enough about it to be like 100% certain. It's such that one person can, by discretion, shut down an information service for a whole country, which seems to have happened. And that judge, if you read historically, has been very aligned with the current party in power, and when the other party was in power, was sort of acting much more politically, them trying to cross assets and do whatever. I think it's a dangerous game, because my understanding is that the Brazilian military relies on Starlink to some degree. So this really set up a very dangerous clash of like, ugh.
Yeah. This is what I'm saying, right? Like the FTC or whatever can't really say this, some things to Elon. And he's like, well, you need my Starlink in Ukraine. What are you going to do about it? Right? Like this is serious geopolitical strategy, right?
The last point I make is just that there are laws where Elon said, okay, in Germany, they have laws specifically, have been on the books for decades about the Holocaust. And he follows the takedowns on those because they've been adjudicated. They're like well established in the law. That's how they view speech as having a limitation on this subject. But this one seemed to not be as adjudicated. So that's why I'm more skeptical that this was done without malice by the government in Brazil.
So first of all, I'm happy to some extent about this, because everybody's moving to Blue Sky, and I'm an investor in Blue Sky. So we're seeing a lot of growth there, and a lot of happy Brazilians using an actual public conversation with open APIs and open standard behind it. So if we're talking about product placement, that's a good pop to put. Second of all, my read is that Elon thinks he owns a country, and he thinks that he has the same power as any other country. And to some extent, he's growing in power. But I think this is going to be an interesting example of a country has an army, and Elon does not have an army. If Brazil actually decides to enforce a law in Brazil, they could use police force, they could use army, and I don't think Elon will have anything to say about it. At a different level, there was a presentation, like a long tweet in Blue Sky about Brazilians and how they think about this. And what they said is that Americans thinks that free speech is the top freedom. And what they said is like not being thrown out of an airplane because you said the wrong thing is the freedom. They want the current government because they don't want martial law, because they don't want the army to own the country. And this is a risky business for non-government companies to get involved in internal politics. So there's a lot of complexities that I think we, and I think the American people, and I think Elon do not understand about Brazilian politics, and playing basically God mode in a country that you don't understand, that you think follows the American rule, is a dangerous business.
I think to Emil's prior point, and I think this is what Chris is setting up here, is the fact that Elon does have some of this hard power. And you're right, of course, Amir, that ultimately, how are all laws enforced? If you sort of peel back enough layers, it is the threat of violence through the military, right? Which typically the governments have a monopoly on. With Elon controlling assets like Starlink that the militaries of these countries rely upon, he starts to get some of that hard power that traditionally is the preserve of nation states. And he's showing that he's willing to use it in a certain extent here by saying that, he is entangling SpaceX and the services it offers with this ban on X. And so it's an interesting world, right? Like, he is acting in some ways like a state actor here.
So it's a very dangerous move because the army could side with him. And we've seen what happens in South America when the army decides to take over a country, because then people start falling off airplanes and shooting themselves in the back of the head. So this is very dangerous steps that he's taking, siding with a power that is unstable and not super 100% democratic like he's used to in the States.
Wait, but hold on. The judge shut down Twitter, told Brazilians they get fined $9,000 a day if they use the VPN, froze the Starlink bank accounts. So by right, he has to say, okay, you're not paying me, Starlink off. Like, what do you, he didn't bring Starlink into it, they did.
Well, is that correct?
So it's not like he was threatening. Yes.
Is it the Starlink bank accounts that they've
Yes.
frozen, or is it the X?
Yes, it was the Starlink bank accounts, and that was part of the thing, is that this judge was saying, like, well, because Elon owns both, and he has removed his legal representative from the country because he didn't want them to be arrested, shut down his office, so Twitter has no office there now.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. That's ridiculous. I think in the past, Elon has been guilty of conflating these separate corporate entities that have different ownership structures in that way. And I've always been critical of that. And so I think when Brazil has done the same thing,
That's
freezing
mad.
Starlink's assets when Starlink has done nothing wrong, I don't think that's
I agree.
And
Right.
so he didn't threaten it. So this is the point, is like, they did. And so far, he hasn't even said, like, I'll stop the service. He's like, fine, freeze the bank accounts. He hasn't, like, made the next move, which it would be his right to say, okay, you're freezing my assets in the country for Starlink. I guess I'm not providing Starlink to the country.
That's 100% legit. I'm just, and I think we might have set the entire conversation on maybe wrong premise, but I think, like, again, I stand behind what I'm saying. Like, when billionaires play in U.S. democracy, it's different when they're playing in other democracies, weaker democracies. And as people have a lot of power, they need to be very mindful. At least, like, from my reading of what that Brazilian doctor said on Blue Sky, they're fearful of external involvement that will, like, digress the country to a unhealthy place.
So let me actually read this. You're right. I think that the premise here, we've gone off on a bit of a tangent. So as part of the feud, the judge ordered the assets of the de facto economic group under Musk's control be frozen to guarantee X pays fines issued by Brazil courts. So Starlink, which is a subsidiary of Musk's aerospace firm SpaceX, of course, has had its assets frozen by Brazil. And now they're saying the order is based on an unfounded determination that Starlink should be responsible for the fines levied unconstitutionally against X. They wrote, we intend to address this matter legally, that we will not afford due process under Brazilian laws. And they're saying SpaceX and X are two different companies with different shareholders, and he only owns 40% of SpaceX, and this legal action is basically improper and has no due
I agree with
due
that.
course. So that's
I agree.
that, that's a different story.